It's been over a decade since we traced the events that led up to the time that God introduced the Feast of Weeks to the nation of Israel. That feast, which was later called the Day of Pentecost or Feast of Pentecost in the New Testament. Therefore, it would be good for us to review that subject and examine what this festival pictures for all of those chosen by God during this present day, this first day of judgment for salvation. The story begins after the first Passover that occurred in Egypt. According to Jewish tradition, the 14th day of the first month, which was called Aviv at that time. Later, of course, it was called Nisan after the Jews went into Babylonian exile and were in captivity in Babylon during the period the 6th century BC. But the 14th of Aviv, of course, was the day on which the lambs were sacrificed. The 14th of Aviv, again, according to Jewish tradition, the year Israel, at the time of the Exodus, was on a Thursday. In other words, the way it would be counted from the evening Wednesday, when Wednesday would start at sunset, until sunset on Thursday. That was the 14th. The 15th would be Thursday sunset to Friday sunset, etc., which again you will see on the chart. We have the 14th. The 14th day was the day that the lambs were sacrificed, which again we know to be in between the two evenings. And then that evening, the 15th, then the lambs were eaten along with the other material that God said was to be partaken of at that time. The beginning of Israel's trek out of Egypt, of course, occurred later on that evening. After the sacrifice of the Passover, the meal was eaten that evening. After the death came on the firstborn of Egypt, Pharaoh called for Moses to tell Moses to take Israel and get out in haste. And so they began their trek, the Israelites did, out of Goshen on the 15th, again, which would be Thursday night, Friday daytime. They traveled all day Friday and encamped that night at a location called Sukkot, as is brought out here in chapter 12 of Exodus, verse 37. Sukkot simply means a place of temporary dwelling. That's what it means. It means booths. In fact, the Feast of Sukkot, or whatever that sometimes is called, what the Jews would call the Feast of Tabernacles. So Sukkot was an encampment. That's what it's talking about. And of course, after Israel had been up all day, the day before on the 14th, after Israel had stayed up through the night and then were driven out, the Egyptians telling them sometime after the firstborn died in Egypt, sometime before the break of day, virtually, right close to the break of day, dawn, is when they were then beginning to be pushed out. And so they were tired. They did not get a good night's sleep that night. They walked all day. They trekked all day until Friday evening, and then they stopped at Sukkot, again meaning an encampment. And so they rested there. They slept because of the length of time they had been up, all of the events that had transpired. Then they moved steadily eastward toward the Egyptian border during the next 6 days of unleavened bread. There is no evidence that they camped. They stopped from time to time in order to rest, to nap, and to eat. But other than that, they continued moving at a steady pace because it was necessary for them to arrive at the Dead Sea on the last day of unleavened bread. And that Dead Sea, not the Dead Sea, the Red Sea was the eastern finger of the Red Sea. Over in the area today, we would say where Eilat is, where the southern tip of Israel meets the Red Sea. That's the location that they were heading for, at least south of there. But when they arrived at the western shore of the Red Sea, it was on the daylight part of the following Thursday, 7 days later. And again, as the chart shows here, that would have been on the 20th of Aviv. It was there that the army of Egypt caught up with the Israelites, causing them to panic. They were terrified. They began blaming Moses for bringing them out into the wilderness and so on. It was there that the army of Egypt, Pharaoh, and his chariots and his horsemen and all, again, caused such panic among the Israelites. And it was there that God placed his presence between Israel and the Egyptians. He did that by, again, he was a pillar of fire, pillar of cloud. He stood between Israel and Egypt, according to the account here in Exodus 14. He was the pillar of fire on the eastern side so that the Israelites could see to go through the Red Sea. He was a pillar of cloud on the western side to keep the Egyptians in darkness until Israel had crossed. It was there that God told Moses to initiate the parting of the water to provide Israel that escape route through the Red Sea. So we come down here to verse 21 of Exodus chapter 14. I'll read from the Tanakh translation. Then Moses held out his arm over the sea, and the Lord drove back the sea with a strong east wind all that night, and turned the sea into dry ground. The waters were split, and the Israelites went into the sea on dry ground, and the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. The Egyptians came in pursuit after them into the sea, all of Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and horsemen. At the morning watch, the Lord looked down upon the Egyptian army from a pillar of fire and cloud, and threw the Egyptian army into panic. He locked the wheels of their chariots, so they moved forward with difficulty. And the Egyptians said, "Let us flee from the Israelites, for the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Hold out your arm over the sea, that the waters may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots and their horsemen." Moses held out his arm over the sea, and at daybreak the sea returned to its normal state, and the Egyptians fled at its approach. But the Lord hurled the Egyptians into the sea. And so, again, that occurred on the seventh day. That was early morning on Thursday when all of this happened. So, we go down to chapter 15 to pick up what happened then. Chapter 15, verse 22. So, Moses brought Israel from the Red Sea. Then they went out into the wilderness of Shur. And they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. Now, when they came to Marah, which was on the third day, they could not drink the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore, the name of it was called Marah, which means bitterness. Since the Egyptians were destroyed at daybreak on the 21st, as again we have here on the chart, Israel continued traveling all daylight portion of Thursday. They then traveled on Friday, day number 2, and then Sabbath, the 23rd. They traveled a certain distance until they came tomorrow. That was the third day of travel, because they had all daylight portion of Thursday, they had Friday, and they had part of the Sabbath according to what we have here. That Sabbath would have been, as again indicated here on the chart where the number 7 is, that Sabbath would have been the first Sabbath after the time that the wave sheaf would later come to be offered. There wasn't a wave sheaf this year. That was not added to, this is just establishing the time, setting the time when Pentecost, the Feast of Weeks, would occur. But as far as the details of when to start it later, that information comes later. So this is the first Sabbath in that count. Exodus 15, verse 27 goes on. Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 wells. Some translations have springs. The Hebrew can be either way, wells or springs, of water, and 70 palm trees. So they camped there by the waters. Now it seems that this stop in Elim, as indicated on the chart, was also on a Sabbath, which would have been the second Sabbath in the count toward Pentecost, and would have occurred on the first day of the second month, which is called Iyar. I-Y-A-R, again, it is here on the chart. So that's day number 1, and it fell on a Sabbath. Although Scripture does not specifically indicate that this stop occurred on the Sabbath, based on the two previous camps, the one at Sukkot and the one at Marah, being on Sabbaths, and the fact that the next two camps, especially the second one after this particular Sabbath, the fourth one, being on a Sabbath, it seems evident that God was making certain that Israel stopped and rested from travel at least part of each Sabbath. Now remember, he hadn't revealed the Sabbath to them at this point, and so he was not holding them accountable for their actions on the Sabbath, but he was establishing that you're going to stop and rest at this point. They did it Sukkot, they did it Marah, and again, he pretty well tells us where they had an encampment for the first month and a half. Let's see. Numbers 33. Hold your place because let's look at a cross-reference here in Numbers 33. Numbers 33 gives us the journeys of the children of Israel from the time that they left Egypt and moved on. And so we have an accounting here, not necessarily every stop, but most of them. Here in verse 9 of Numbers 33, we're going to come back to Exodus, so don't lose your place there. It says, they moved from Marah and came to Elim. At Elim there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees. So they camped there. Then verse 10, they moved from Elim and camped by the Red Sea. This would have been, as on the chart, ER 8, another Sabbath. This would have been Sabbath number 3 since leaving Egypt, the time that they actually left. All right, then we find in verse 11, they moved from the Red Sea and camped in the wilderness of Sin. That would have been the 4th Sabbath on ER 15. The 1st is a Sabbath, the 8th is a Sabbath, the 15th is a Sabbath. The date of the encampment in the wilderness of Sin is recorded back again in Exodus chapter 16. Here in Exodus 16, verse 1, and they journeyed from Elim, and all the congregation of the children of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the 2nd month after they departed from the land of Egypt. So it was the 15th. It was at that time that God finally revealed the Sabbath to Israel. Prior to this, other than asking Moses or telling Moses this is a place to stop and making camp and having a longer rest than on any of the other days of the week, God allowed Israel to do pretty much whatever they wanted, to treat the 7th day of the week pretty much like any of the other days. He allowed that. But now, once we come to the 4th Sabbath, as we are here, God takes a period of 7 days to reveal how the 7th day is different than all of the other 6 days of the week. Verse 4, Tanakh goes on, and the Lord said to Moses, I will rain down. Now, I didn't bring out verses 2 and 3. Israel, everybody's arguing and griping and grumbling because Moses brought them here and they have nothing to eat. Okay, so I skipped that, summarize it right there. Verse 4, and the Lord said to Moses, I'm going to rain down bread for you from the sky, and the people shall go out and gather each day that day's portion, that I may thus test them to see whether they will follow my instructions or not. But on the 6th day, when they apportion what they have brought in, it shall prove to be double the amount they gather each day. So, in other words, he says, when they go out on the 6th day, which we know to be Friday in our terminology, whatever they gather is going to end up being twice what it is on the other days. In other words, there's going to be a miracle that takes place come Friday. There's going to be a miraculous event that takes place. It will be double whatever they normally gather in. Verse 6, so Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, by evening you shall know it was the Lord who brought you out from the land of Egypt. And in the morning you shall behold the presence, or the other translations would say glory, the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumblings against the Lord. For who are we? Aaron and me, Moses says. Who are we that you should grumble against us? Since it is the Lord, Moses continued, who will give you flesh to eat in the evening and bread in the morning to the full, because the Lord has heard the grumblings you utter against him. What is our part? All we're doing, he tells us, he moves here, the pillar of cloud gets up and goes, and we have to follow. All we do is tell you it's time to go when God shows us it's time to. It's God, it's not us. Moses pointed them back to God. He didn't point them to himself, like there's some people today that want to point to me. I'm the apostle, or I'm whatever, or what, ever. You got all kinds of nutty things today. Moses, not. It's God. God is the one. He pointed them to God. Anyway, he goes on to say here, your grumbling is not against us, but against the Lord. Then, verse 9, Moses said to Aaron, say to the whole Israelite community, advance toward the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling. And as Aaron spoke to the whole Israelite community, they turned toward the wilderness, and there in a cloud appeared the presence of the Lord. The Lord spoke to Moses, I have heard the grumbling of the Israelites. Speak to them and say, by evening you shall eat flesh, and in the morning you shall have your fill of bread. And you shall know that I, the Lord, am your God. In the evening, then, quail appeared and covered the camp. So God caused these quail to come into their encampment probably just after the Sabbath ended. While it was still dusk, all of the quail come in to roost, and Israel then has a phenomenal quail slaughter, and they are able to gorge themselves on quail meat that evening. Then we go on in verse 13, Tanakh. In the morning there was a fall of dew about the camp. When the fall of dew lifted, there over the surface of the wilderness lay a fine and flaky substance. Some other translations, including the New King James, says a small round substance. So flaky or small round, as fine as frost on the ground. When the Israelites saw it, they said to one another, what is it? Now, the New King James says they called it is manna, because manna means, in the Hebrew, what is it? What is it? And so, again, what is it? They had, again, it goes on to say, for they did not know what it was. They had never seen anything like this. They had never seen any kind of grain or any kind of food that was appearing in this form and fashion. Moses said to them, this is the bread which the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Gather as much of it as each of you requires to eat. That is what's going to be necessary to satisfy your hunger. That's what that means. An omer to a person for as many of you as there are. Note, an omer per person. So everyone would receive 1 omer. It would take 1 omer in order to satisfy the hunger of each person. Didn't matter how small or how large that person was. There's something in that manna that would fill them up faster if maybe they ate more than what others would eat. And those who ate very light, they would still be hungry and they would have to eat until they finished off their omer that day. That's what that means. This is a miraculous bread. It is not just the normal physical type of bread. It was physical, yes, but there is a miracle attached to it. So, he says, an omer to a person for as many of you as there are, each of you shall fetch for those in his tent. The Israelites did so, some gathering much, some little. That is, some thought, well, I don't eat that much, so I'm not going to get as much, and, well, I'm starving, so I'm going to get a lot more. Okay, this is what was going on. But when they measured it by the omer, they get back to their tent, they start, okay, Sally, this is yours. Yoshebed, this is yours. Aaron, this is yours. It all turned out, he who had gathered much had no excess. Came out to exactly an omer per person. And he who had gathered little had no deficiency. They had gathered as much as they needed to eat. That is, as much as they needed to satisfy their hunger. A miracle with the manna. And we're going to see why. Now, we go on here in verse 22, and I'll read this from the New International. On the sixth day, they gathered twice as much, 2 omers for each person. And the leaders of the community came and reported this to Moses. He said to them, "This is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow is a day of rest." It's to be a day of rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. So, bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil. Save whatever is left and keep it until morning. Now, before, when they had tried to keep it over earlier that week, it rotted and stank and maggots filled it. So, it absolutely wrecked the smell of the tents. And so, it was not exactly a pleasant thing. And so the people were maybe a little reticent in saving it over again. But now they're commanded, you save it over, it won't happen this time. And so they did. We find here that God introduced the importance of preparing in advance for the Sabbath. This is the origin of the day of preparation. You do it today. You prepare today on the 6th day. That way it's all ready come the 7th day. Here's the origin. God established a day of preparation. It's not man that did it. It wasn't the Jews that did it. God did it right here. Verse 24, New International goes on. So they saved it until morning as Moses commanded. And it did not stink or get maggots in it. Eat it today, Moses said, because today is a Sabbath to the Lord. You will not find any of it on the ground today. 6 days you are to gather it, but on the 7th day, the Sabbath, there will not be any. Moses stated emphatically that this day, the Sabbath, was special to God. Therefore, he would not send manna on that day. The Israelites had other responsibility that day to be focused on God, not focused on gathering. They were already prepared from on the 6th day what they did. We find then, as the chart indicates, this was the 5th Sabbath since they had left Egypt by crossing through the Red Sea. It was also on the 5th Sabbath since the time when the wave sheaf offering would be lifted in the future. Now, after God had revealed the importance of the weekly Sabbath during the 8-day encampment in the wilderness of Sin, because they arrived on the Sabbath, and it was that evening, remember, and the quail came, and so they've been there all that time through the next Sabbath. 8 full days they were there in the wilderness of Sin. After that, God had them break camp on the first day of the week and move on with 2 midweek stops that particular week. Exodus 17, verse 1. Tanakh translates, "From the wilderness of Sin, the whole Israelite community continued by stages as the Lord would command." That is, they would go so far and camp, then they would take up camp, go after a couple of days, and move on. Now, the 2 stops they made, the stages, in this case, are recorded in Numbers chapter 33 again, which gives us the various places they did travel and camp. Numbers 33, verse 12, they set out from the wilderness of Sin and encamped at Dophkah. They set out from Dophkah and encamped at Elush. They set out, verse 14, they set out from Elush and encamped at Rephidim. So Rephidim was 1 week after the wilderness of Sin encampment. So this was the next Sabbath. They arrived at Rephidim on the 28th day of Iyar. Again, as I have it here on the camp, on the timeline. They arrived there on the 28th and prepared for the Sabbath. Then they kept the Sabbath. Well, actually, they arrived on the 27th. Then they kept the Sabbath on the 28th. This was the 6th Sabbath in the count from the time when the wave sheaf would later be offered in the future. Going on here in Exodus 17, verse 1 again, they encamped at Rephidim, and there was no water for the people to drink. And so the next couple of verses, Israel is very upset with Moses for leading him out to die of thirst. So, verse 4, Tanakh translates, Moses cried out to the Lord, saying, "What shall I do with this people? Before long they will be stoning me." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Pass before the people, take with you some of the elders of Israel, take along the rod with which you struck the Nile, and set out. And I will be standing there before you on the rock at Horeb." That is, God would appear over a rock as a pillar of cloud, apparently. It's daytime. He's a pillar of fire at night, pillar of cloud in the day. "And I'll be standing on the rock. Strike the rock, and water will issue from it, and the people will drink." And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. So only 1 week after God had proven that the seventh day of the week was set apart from the other 6 days by withholding the presence of manna, the distribution of manna on the Sabbath, he now provided them water from the rock on which he stood. So that symbolized it came from him, just as the manna from heaven came from him. On these back-to-back Sabbaths, God had provided the two things that Israel absolutely required for survival: bread or food and water. There was no way that they could continue to live, to have life physically, without the bread and without the water. The bread from heaven and the water from the rock. Within a few days after God provided them water, Israel, as we go on here, was attacked by the Amalekites, down here in verse 8. After the Amalekites were defeated by the army of Israel led by Joshua, Israel then moved on. We come to Exodus chapter 19 now, and in verse 1, "In the 3rd month after the children of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on the same day." Now, that means on the same day of the week. The same day of the month won't work. The same day of the week works. So, after they came out of Egypt, on the same day of the week, they came to the wilderness of Sinai. Israel, remember, again on the chart, came up out of the Red Sea during Wednesday night, early Thursday morning. It was at the time of the morning watch. Remember, God had the sea return. So they pretty much came out and were out in the darkness of Wednesday night, Thursday morning. And then, early Thursday morning, on the 21st of Aviv, again from the chart here, they set out and began moving on Thursday. So it would be Thursday here in Exodus 19:1, on the same day of the week that they left Egyptian territory, was the same day that they arrived at the wilderness of Sinai. So they arrived here before sunset on Thursday. Got there the same day. They left out from the Red Sea early Thursday, again, right after, at the time of the Exodus. Now they arrive on a Thursday, but it's late Thursday by the time they get to that point. Now, verse 2, the New Living Translation has, "After breaking camp at Rephidim, they came to the wilderness of Sinai and set up camp there at the base of Mount Sinai. Then Moses climbed the mountain to appear before God. The Lord called to him from the mountain and said, 'Give these instructions to the family of Jacob, announce it to the descendants of Israel.'" Verse 4 goes on in the New King James, "You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant," the conditions, obey my voice, keep my covenant. If you do this, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine. In other words, if anybody wants to argue the point that I'm going to give you special privileges, that's too bad. I created it all. It all belongs to me. I can do whatever I want to with it, and I want to make you, Israel, my treasured above all other nations. It's one reason why Israel is hated so much today, the name Israel. He goes on. Verse 6, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which you shall speak to the children of Israel. So, verse 7, Moses came and called for the elders of the people and laid before them all these words which the Lord had commanded him. Then all the people answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do. So Moses brought back the words of the people to the Lord. And the Lord said to Moses, behold, I come to you in the thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with you, and believe you forever. So Moses told the words of the people to the Lord. That is, they agreed. They agreed to what you said. Verse 10, Tanakh then picks up, and the Lord said to Moses, go to the people and warn them to stay pure today and tomorrow. Let them wash their clothes. Let them be ready for the third day. For on the third day the Lord will come down in the sight of all the people on Mount Sinai. So, Moses apparently met with God late Thursday afternoon once Israel arrived at the base of Mount Sinai. Friday then would be the first day, day number 1, which, again, I've got the calendar here, or the timeline showing the calendar period. And the Sabbath then, that Sabbath would be the second day. And then Sunday would be the third day, because they got there late Thursday just before the Friday, the next day would start in the Hebrew calendar. Friday would start at midnight that night. And so we have 1, 2, 3, brings us to Sunday. That Sabbath was the 7th Sabbath, as indicated on the chart here, from the time when the wave sheaf offering would be presented in the future. That Sabbath completed, as indicated here, 49 days from the time when the wave sheaf would have been offered. The third day, Sunday, would be the 50th day. Now, in all that we read here, whether Numbers 33 or in Exodus chapter 19 or 20, you find nothing was mentioned at this time indicating that the 50th day would be called the Feast of Weeks or the Feast of Pentecost, the day of Pentecost. Nothing indicates that. But we'll see when God told them the name. Let's go on here in verse 12 in the New International. God still instructing Moses on this particular day, put limits. The New Living Translation says, mark off a boundary. Other translations say, erect a barrier. Okay? For the people around the mountain, and tell them, be careful that you do not go up the mountain or touch the foot of it. Whoever touches the mountain shall surely be put to death. He shall surely be stoned or shot with arrows. Not a hand is to be laid on him, whether man or animal. He shall not be permitted to live. You can't reach out, pull him back, because you're going to be a dead person too, basically what God says. Anybody that touches the mount is going to be required to suffer the death penalty. Only when the ram's horn sounds a long blast may they go up to the mountain, that is, to the base of the mountain. After Moses had gone down the mountain to the people, he consecrated them, and they washed their clothes. Then he said to the people, prepare yourselves for the third day. Abstain from sexual relations. On the morning of the third day there was thunder and lightning with a thick cloud over the mountain and a very long trumpet blast. Everyone in the camp trembled. Then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. So this was on the the third day. This was on what we would say the first day of the week, or Sunday. Verse 18, Tanakh translates, "Now Mount Sinai was all in smoke, for the Lord had come down upon it in fire. And the smoke rose like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled violently. The blare of the horn grew louder and louder. As Moses spoke, God answered him in thunder. The Lord came down upon Mount Sinai on the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. The Lord said to Moses, 'Go down, warn the people not to break through to the Lord or gaze, lest many of them perish. The priests also who come near the Lord must stay pure, lest the Lord break out against them.' But Moses said to the Lord, 'The people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for you warned us.'" You already warned us, remember? Did you forget? You told me that on Thursday, and I did that. I already erected a barrier. I've already done all of these things. "For you warned us, saying, 'Set bounds about the mountain and sanctify it.'" Now here's Moses. Well, the people don't need to be told again. This people? God's the one that's leading us. Why grumble against me? You don't need to warn them a second time? Okay, so Moses is arguing. God says, "Come up." Moses goes up. He gets there. God says, "Go back down." Well, hold it. I just made this trek up them. Now, remember, this is not like Mount Everest. It's more of, it probably wasn't more than 500 or 600 feet, maybe 1,000 feet. It was not what we think of as, the Matterhorn. So it didn't take Moses that long. It still took time for him to go to the top, especially if this is the Mount Sinai that, if it was Wyatt or whoever, shows where it's blackened on top and all. It's not that large. It's not that far that he has to go up. But at any rate, Moses, I hate to go back down, come back up again. So, verse 24, the Lord said to him, "Go down and come back together with Aaron, but let not the priest or the people break through to come to the Lord, lest he break out against them." And Moses went down to the people and spoke to them. They needed to be warned again and again and again and again and again, as we know, and as Moses learned over the next 40 years. Now, in Exodus chapter 20 then, verses 1 through 17, God spoke all the words of the Ten Commandments as the basic law upon which he was making a covenant with Israel. And it was located at Sinai, hence it's called the Sinaitic covenant, or the Sinaitic covenant. The people were terrified by God being there and God speaking the words. And so they begged Moses, and they said, "Please, Moses, you relay God's instructions to us so that we don't have to be that close. Rather than us having to listen to God directly, you bring us his words." And so Moses did that, and he records a more lengthy account of God's response to the people's request in Deuteronomy, when he reminded them at the end of the 40 years wandering what had happened way back then. And here in Deuteronomy 5, verse 28, Deuteronomy 5:28, "Then the Lord," again, Moses is going back over, rehashing what happened years earlier, "Then the Lord heard the voice of your words when you spoke to me, and the Lord said to me, I have heard the voice of the words of this people which they have spoken to you. They are right in all that they have spoken. Oh, that they had such a heart in them that they would fear me and always keep my commandments, and keep all my commandments, that it might be well with them and with their children forever. Go and say to them, return to your tents." Okay, you're dismissed, going back to your tents. What your request has been granted. God's going to speak just to me. "But as for you, Moses, stand here by me, and I will speak to you all the commandments, the statutes, and the judgments which you shall teach them, that they may observe them in the land which I am giving them to possess." Once it was determined that Moses would relay God's instructions to the people, God gave Moses the judgments that were included in the covenant he was making with Israel. They're recorded here in Exodus chapter 20, beginning in verse 22, and going through chapter 21, 22, and to the end of chapter 23. So we have judgments, we have statutes here that make up the book of the covenant. And so Moses then heard God speak all of these words. God concluded giving him all of this instruction by telling him to go back to the camp and bring Aaron and his 2 sons, Nadab and Abihu, along with 70 elders of Israel. That's here in chapter 24, verses 1 and 2. Moses then went down from the mount after God spoke all of the words of the covenant, the judgments and the statutes, and that was on Sunday. May have been late on Sunday afternoon, but it was on Sunday. It was the first day of the week. He came back down. He then relayed, what a mind. You know, God obviously put the words there, but everything God had told him, Moses now speaks to the people. Every word. Every word. He relayed what God had said. Note, verse 3, Exodus 24. So Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the judgments. And all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words which the Lord has said we will do. And Moses wrote all the words of the Lord. So before the first day of the week ended at sunset, the people all agreed on that 50th day to the terms of the covenant. They said, we will do, or I do. They said, I do to the marriage contract that God was making with them there at Mount Sinai. We're going to do it. We agree to the terms. We'll make this vow with God. And then, once they agreed, Moses went and wrote all the words down. Everything that he had verbally told them, he now wrote in hard copy. Verse 4 goes on. And he rose early in the morning, that would be the second day of the week, or Monday, and built an altar at the foot of the mountain, and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. Then he sent young men of the children of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to the Lord. Now, this was before God took the tribe of Levi to himself as the firstborn. So these individuals were from different tribes of Israel. But eventually, remember, God took the tribe of Levi as the firstborn instead of the firstborn of all of Israel. All the firstborn males, he took the tribe of Levi, and then from the tribe of Levi, the household of Aaron became the priests. Not all Levites are priests, only those who descend from Aaron, who was a Levite. And Moses took, verse 6, Moses took half the blood and put it in basins, and half the blood he sprinkled on the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read in the hearing of the people. Now, the book of the covenant is what he wrote down, the words that he had written from what he had spoken the day before. The words he brought down from God, he told them all. They said, we'll do it. He wrote them all down. Now he takes what he wrote, and he's reading what he wrote so that they have, okay, this is what I wrote. You know, did I leave anything out? Anybody got a problem? This is exactly what I said yesterday, but I'm going to read it so that you are witnesses that this is the agreement that you made. And so it says, they all said, all that the Lord has said we will do, and be obedient. And Moses took the blood, sprinkled it on the people then, and said, this is the blood of the covenant which the Lord has made with you according to all these words. So Moses stressed that that marriage contract made at Sinai with Israel, made with God, was bound with animal blood. Now, verse 9. Then Moses went up, also Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel. And they saw the God of Israel. And there was under his feet, as it were, a paved work of sapphire stone. And it was like the very heavens, or the very sky, some of the other translations have, in its clarity. So you could see through it. It was crystal, a sea of glass. A sea of crystal, as it's described back in Revelation chapter 4 and 5. But on the nobles of the children of Israel, note this, he did not lay his hand. Now remember the day before. Don't anybody touch this. Moses, you can come up here. Then Moses, you bring Aaron. Now, okay, you bring Aaron and his sons and 70 elders. You've been invited. Once you've been invited, you can come up. You can approach me, but nobody else. So again, showing that it is by special invitation that we can have a relationship with God and that we can partake as they did. Because it says here that God did not lay his hand on the children of Israel, the ones who came up. So they saw God and they ate and drank. What they experienced, those 74 men, what they experienced was a type of what the first fruits will actually do before the throne of God in heaven after the first resurrection. This pictures the marriage supper. It follows the first resurrection. And we'll come to that. All right, verse 15 of Exodus 24, the Tanakh translates, when Moses had ascended the mountain, the cloud covered the mountain, the presence of the Lord abode on Mount Sinai, and the cloud hid it for 6 days. On the seventh day he called to Moses from the midst of the cloud. Now, the presence of the Lord appeared in the sight of the Israelites as a consuming fire on the top of the mountain. Now, in dealing with Israel at that time, God was guiding a series of events that would culminate on a day that would later be identified or revealed as holy time. The nation did not understand the implication of what the 50th day was until the following year, after Moses had been given the material in the book of Leviticus to write. Now, they didn't understand the implication, even though God pointed out here in the book of the covenant, which again is the latter part of chapter 20 and then down through chapter 23. But here in Exodus 23, verse 14, Moses had read this to the people. First he told them people, then he read it to the people. God included in the book of the covenant this very festival, but he didn't make any, at least in the scripture, he did not say, now this is the day we're doing this. Rather, we find here in Exodus 23, verse 14, God pointed out there would be, in the covenant, there would be special holy days that would be repeated annually. And here in verse 14 of Exodus 23, 3 times you shall keep a feast to me in the year, God said to Israel. You shall keep the feast of unleavened bread. You shall eat unleavened bread 7 days as I commanded you at the time appointed in the month of Aviv, for in it you came out of Egypt. None shall appear before me empty. Now he's reminding them of something that had only occurred 7 weeks earlier. Because when they came out of Egypt, he told them all about the days of unleavened bread. He even told them when it would be, what day of the month, which month it would be. This is the first month, Moses, and it's going to be on the 14th month that you sacrifice the lambs. The 15th month, the 15th of the month through the 21st will be the days of unleavened bread, when no one is to eat any unleavened bread, and you are to eat leavened bread all 7 days. Remember, he stressed that. And so he's reminding them at that point. But then he goes on, and the feast of harvest. This is the second time. The feast of harvest, the first fruits of your labors, which you have sown in the field. And thirdly, the feast of ingathering at the end of the year, when you have gathered in the fruit of all your labors from the field. 3 times in the year all your males shall appear before the Lord God. Now, there is no indication here in the book of the covenant as to the exact months or days on which the feast of harvest of first fruits or the feast of ingathering were to occur. He doesn't tell us that here. That instruction came with the book of Leviticus and what God inspired Moses to record there. So let's go to Leviticus chapter 23 now. Leviticus 23. Of course, it begins, God spoke to Moses and told him to tell the children of Israel. Note here in verse 3, 6 days shall work be done. The 7th day is the Sabbath of rest. All right, so he points out that the Sabbath is the 7th day of the week. It's a day of rest. Now, verse 4, these are the feasts of the Lord, holy convocations or sacred assemblies, as the New International has, which you shall proclaim at their appointed times. Verse 5, on the 14th day of the month, the 14th day of the first month at twilight, at even, is the Lord's Passover. And on the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread to the Lord. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work on it, but you shall offer an offering made by fire to the Lord for 7 days. The seventh day shall be a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work on it. Now, all God says here is that they will be days of holy convocation, the first and the last. He says nothing here about them being a Sabbath. Now, we know that they're annual Sabbaths, but he does not give that information here because he doesn't want to confuse anybody. He wants to make it so simple that nobody can be confused. And yet, there are people that get confused on this in the way they determine when to count Pentecost. Okay. Verse 10. Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land which I give you. You're not going to have to do this until we get into the land. Now, that could have been later that year, but, of course, they wouldn't go up when God told them to go up. And so it wasn't that year after all. It's going to be, decades later before this actually happens. But at the time, it sounds like it's just going to be here in another month or so. We're going to be doing this. And so after we get into the land. Nope, that didn't work out quite that way. But when you come to the land which I give you and reap its harvest, then you shall bring a sheaf. The Hebrew word is omer, which is a dry measure. You shall bring an omer of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest. Verse 11, Tanakh. He, the priest, shall elevate the omer before the Lord for acceptance in your behalf. Note, it's 1 omer. And it's no coincidence that the amount of grain used in this offering was the exact amount of manna that each Israelite received. And omer was the amount that miraculously satisfied the daily hunger of each and every Israelite. No coincidence whatsoever. The wave sheaf, or elevated omer, represented the resurrected Messiah who ascended to the Father to be accepted as the sacrifice that alone can atone for the sins of mankind. The miracle of each person being satisfied by eating 1 omer of manna each day pictured taking into oneself the bread of life, the Messiah, Jesus Christ, which Jesus referred to back in John chapter 6. Let's note this. Hold your place in Leviticus. We'll be back. But here in John chapter 6, Jesus had fed a vast multitude. The people showed up again because they wanted to get another free meal. And so then he begins telling them because they brought up the manna. And so Jesus begins referring to himself and comparing himself to the manna. Here in John 6, verse 48, Jesus stated, I am the bread of life. Your ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, and they died. They ate the manna. It kept them alive physically, but eventually they died, so it didn't give them life beyond the physical. This, speaking about himself then, probably saying this, that was then, that was the manna. This bread. This is the bread that comes down from heaven, as he points to himself, so that one may eat of it and not die. This bread, himself, you eat of me, you take me in, and you will not die. He's speaking here about not dying, that is, ceasing to exist. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats of this bread will live forever. This is the true manna. And the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. Down in verse 57, just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father. He is in me. His Spirit is in me. So whoever eats me, whoever takes me in, as the omer each day, will live because of me. Because of my presence in them, they will live. And not just live physically, they will live eternally. This is the bread that came down from heaven. That's what that bread represented. That's what it symbolized. Not like that which your ancestors ate and they died. They ate it physically. But the one who eats this bread who came from heaven will live forever. And so, again, no coincidence that the omer, that the wave sheaf, the omer, is one omer. And all Israelites were satisfied after eating one omer each day. Back in chapter 23 of Leviticus, verse 11, we continue. The priest, Tanakh translates, shall elevate it, the omer, on the day after the Sabbath. Now, once God began relaying the appointed times of his festivals here in this section, in Leviticus 23, God never referred to the holy days on the first and last days of unleavened bread as Sabbaths. I already pointed that out. Called them holy convocation, sacred. He did not call them Sabbaths. Purposely, he did not call them Sabbaths, even though they were. The only Sabbath that has been identified, the only day identified as a Sabbath, is the one that comes every seventh day. The Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath. That was it. Therefore, this instruction he gives in verse 11 establishes that the wave sheaf ceremony must fall on the first day of the week. It must. Not like the Jews figure it today. It's always can be any day of the week when it can happen. Because they count from the first day of unleavened bread being a Sabbath. And if it falls on a Wednesday, it's going to be, it doesn't fall the way. And so they always have the Feast of Weeks on the same day of Sivan every year. They don't do it correctly. They do it incorrectly. So, it must occur on the first day of the week. And since Jesus fulfilled what the wave sheaf symbolized during the days of unleavened bread, the ceremony, which is proven by the gospel accounts, the ceremony of the wave sheaf, the lifted or elevated omer, must fall on the first day of the week that occurs during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It's not the Sabbath during the day of unleavened bread that's important. It's the first day of the week that falls in the days of unleavened bread. It must fall in the days of unleavened bread, or it's not kept correctly, based upon what we have here. And God made sure he didn't mess anything up, because he doesn't mention the Sabbath till we get down to atonement and shows us that that's the way you need to figure these. But he didn't want to confuse anybody, but people want to get confused. They seem to want to be confused. Anyway, enough of that. Verse 12. Tanakh goes on the day that you elevate the sheaf, or you elevate the omer, you shall offer as a burnt offering to the Lord a lamb of the first year without blemish. The meal offering with it shall be 2/10 of a measure of choice flour with oil mixed in, an offering by fire of pleasing odor to the Lord. It had that grain offering had frankincense in it. And the libation with it shall be of wine, 1/4 of a hin. Until that very day, until you have brought the offering of your God, you shall eat no bread or parched grain or fresh ears. It is a law for all time throughout the ages in all your settlements. So God made it very clear here that the wave sheaf ceremony was required to be performed before the first harvest could begin. Had to be. Whenever that ceremony did not fall on the first day of unleavened bread, that is, on a Sunday, the barley harvest could begin at noon. Could begin at noon. Once the ceremony was conducted, a predetermined harvest period was to elapse, culminating with a related ceremony 50 days later. Note here in verse 15. Tanakh translates, and from the day on which you bring the sheaf of elevation offering, the day after the Sabbath, you shall count off 7 weeks or 7 Sabbaths. The New King James and several other translations have. You shall count off 7 Sabbaths. Because he's already told us what Sabbath it is. It's the weekly Sabbath we begin to count. You shall count off 7 weeks, that is 7 Sabbaths. They must be complete. You got to have a complete week, from day 1 of the week to day 7 of the week. 7 complete. You must count until the day after the 7th week, or after the 7th Sabbath, 50 days. Then you shall bring an offering of new grain to the Lord. The Revised English Bible has, you shall bring a grain offering from the new crop. This period of 50 days was the total length of time that God appointed for gathering the first harvest. Only the grain collected during the 50 days period of that harvest could be used for making the new grain offering. Remember, God established 3 festival seasons during the year. We saw that in the Book of the Covenant, Exodus chapter 23, verses 14 through 16. There were 3, but only 2 of those seasons. Only 2 of those seasons represented harvest seasons. Passover unleavened bread does not represent a harvest season, but the second and the third both do. At the time the first harvest is reaped, nothing from the fall harvest period is ready and mature. It's not ready to be reaped at that point. In fact, some of the fall harvest isn't even planted at the time when the grain harvest is harvested. This means it's impossible for those from the later harvest period to participate in the events of the earlier harvest. It's absolutely impossible. These 2 harvest periods clearly prove that this is not the only day of salvation. This is not the only day of salvation. These harvest periods, the fact that there's more than one, teach us that God is not attempting to save all of humanity at this time. If God is attempting to do it, He is doing a miserable job, if it's today. Because the world is more evil today than it was last year. And last year was more evil than the year before. God is perfect, and God is in charge, and God is showing by what man is doing, He is not attempting to save them all today. That's the reason He's got another harvest coming up later on. The fall harvest, the much greater harvest, includes the second day of salvation, which occurs following the return of Christ, the 1,000 years reign of Christ. The third day of judgment for salvation shortly follows the second. And it's for all of those who have lived from the time of Adam until the last of the individuals who die when Gog and Magog are destroyed after the 1,000 years and the events after the 1,000 years when Satan is released. They are then resurrected in the white throne judgment time. Because all of those people, they haven't received forgiveness. They have not received the coming of God's grace. Not yet in their lives, because God has not selected them. They're still at the base of Mount Sinai. You haven't been invited up here, God says. I'm not inviting you. Aaron, your 2 sons, Moses, 70 elders, that's it, nobody else. He shows us even by that He is very selective right now in this day of judgment. Now, back to the culmination here of the first harvest period, the ceremony on the 50th day. Verse 17. Tanakh has, you shall bring from your settlements 2 loaves of bread as an elevation offering. Each shall be made of 2/10 of a measure of choice flour, baked after leavening, as first fruits to the Lord. Now these 2 loaves are made from flour, which is ground from the grain harvested over the period of 7 weeks. Has to be from that particular harvest. However, these loaves are different from the first omer of the harvest, the sacrifice, or rather the ceremony that was made 50 days earlier. The first omer was lifted up during the days of unleavened bread. That omer representing the Messiah, Jesus Christ. That omer was lifted up during the days of unleavened bread when no leavening could be found in any of the dwellings of the Israelites. No leavening could possibly be in that. In fact, God does not tell them to put leavening in that particular ceremony, that omer of grain, of flour. These two loaves here in verse 17 are commanded to be baked after leavening. These are leavened loaves, not flat, unleavened loaves of bread, as was the omer. These two loaves are designated as, note the last part of verse 17, the first fruits to the Lord. They're the holy ones. They're the saints of God. Since this ceremony requires two loaves, the indication is that the first fruits are composed of two distinct groups. Since the loaves are of equal size, there are at least two possibilities, and maybe more, maybe even a third, but hard to say. The first, of course, the dead and the living, which is brought out by what the Apostle Paul tells us back in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Okay, it could be this way, the dead and the living. Here in 1 Thessalonians 4:13, the Apostle Paul delineates something for us. He says, "But I do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning those who have fallen asleep, those who died, lest you sorrow as others who have no hope. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so God will bring with him those who sleep in Jesus," that is, those who have died. "For this we say to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord will by no means precede those who are asleep. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of an archangel, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first." That would be the first loaf, if this is what he's talking about. "Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them after being changed from being mortal to immortal," as 1 Corinthians 15 brings out. This would be the second loaf. We're brought up, caught up in the clouds together to meet the Lord in the air, and thus we shall always be with the Lord. Therefore comfort one another with these words. So one group would be the dead in Christ, who are first resurrected, and the second group would be those who are still living at the time the seventh trump is sounded, who will be changed from flesh to spirit. This would require exactly half of the people to be dead and half of them still living. That's a possibility because we have no clue. Okay? So that's one possibility. The other is male and female. This would make it simpler, but, God hasn't told us exactly for sure what, but male and female. One loaf could be composed of those who have experienced life having the male attributes of God, and the other half, the other loaf, composed of those who have gone through life's experiences possessing the female qualities of God, because he divided them up. We know male and female are different. God gave one certain attributes and gave the other others, and it's a matter of becoming one and making those attributes mesh. That's part of the objective of marriage. Now, this, of course, would allow for varying percentages of those who have died or are alive. You could have a small group still living, but if it's male and female and he's figured it out 50-50, then, again, it works. We could say those who were the patriarchs and the prophets and so on, that had the Spirit of Christ in them, as Peter would tell us. Maybe that's one loaf, and then everybody from, the time of Jesus after his resurrection and those who began the New Testament, maybe that's one. If that's the case, it seems like there aren't that many in Hebrews 11. The loaf would be different sizes, but maybe it's talking about the composition and not the size. The composition is exactly the same, made with the same product, and it still takes the Spirit of Christ in order to be part of that resurrection. Anyway, we'll find out one of these days. No matter what groups are being symbolized by the two loaves, all of the saints, by what he shows here in verse 17, all are guilty of sin and therefore must be represented with leavening. It was due to the presence of this leavening that the first omer was required to be lifted up and presented to God 50 days earlier, at the time of the wave sheaf. Okay, going on here in chapter 23 of Leviticus and verse 19. You shall also offer one he-goat as a sin offering. This sacrifice represented the atoning for what the leavening symbolized in the 2 loaves. This verse goes on to mention here another offering associated with the lifting of the loaves and 2 male lambs of the first year as a sacrifice of peace offering. The peace offering was the only offering to be shared by God with the priest and the people. Only one. Normally, the priest shared. God got a portion, the priest got a portion. But with the peace offering or fellowship offering, the people who brought the offering, they also were able to partake. In the peace or fellowship offering, as it's also called, the people were allowed to eat most of the parts of the animal that had been offered. This offering signified that the people were being allowed to enjoy a meal by God's special permission in His very presence. Because where did they share the fellowship? They didn't take it home with them. They brought the animal was they did it right there at the tabernacle. Later, they ate it right there at the temple. And God, of course, is represented as being there in the Holy of Holies. And so that's what it symbolizes, what it showed. In verse 20, Tanakh has, the priest shall elevate these, the 2 lambs, together with the bread of the first fruits, as an elevation offering before the Lord. They shall be holy to the Lord for the priest. The 2 wave or elevated loaves are holy to God and are intended for the priest. That's who they're for. Verse 21, and you shall proclaim on the same day that it is a holy convocation to you. You shall do no customary work on it. It shall be a statute forever in all your dwellings throughout your generations. So the loaves were lifted up to God on the 50th day, on Pentecost. The ceremony of lifting these loaves at the end of the first fruits harvest symbolized the culmination of the first day of judgment for salvation. In other words, what happens at the very close of this age, the first resurrection, the ascension of the immortal saints with Jesus to God the Father in heaven. And for the events that immediately follow, the time of coronation, the time of the marriage supper. All of those things depicted in Daniel chapter 7, Revelation 14, 15, 19. In fact, let's go back to Revelation 14. Revelation 14, verse 1, John says in this vision, I looked, and behold, a lamb standing on Mount Zion, with him 144,000, having his Father's name written on their foreheads. And I heard a voice from heaven, like the voice of many waters, like the voice of thunder. I heard the sound of harpists playing with harps, and they sang as it were. Who sang? The 144,000. They sang as it were a new song before the throne. Which throne? Before the 4 living creatures. Pretty obvious. It's the one where God is, in the 3rd heaven. And the elders. And no one could learn that song except the 144,000 who were redeemed from the earth. So Jesus, remember, gathers all of the resurrected and changed saints from the earth, brings them back with him. They follow him wherever he goes to appear before the throne. Let's go to chapter 15, verse 1. Then I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous, 7 angels having the 7 last plagues, for in them the wrath of God is complete. And I saw something like a sea of glass mingled with fire, and those who have the victory over the beast, his image, his mark, over the number of his name, where? Standing on the sea of glass, having harps of God. And they sing the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb, saying, Great and marvelous are your works, Lord God Almighty. Just and true are your ways, O King of the saints. So here they are again. After being brought before the Father, the first fruits will praise him in song, then fulfill what was pictured by Moses, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel on the day after the first Pentecost. Note, Revelation chapter 19, verse 6. And I heard, as it were, the voice of a great multitude, or the roar of a huge crowd, Complete Jewish Bible has. As the sound of many waters, as the sound of mighty thunderings, saying, Alleluia, for the Lord God omnipotent reigns. Let us be glad and rejoice and give him glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his wife, his bride, other translations, has made herself ready, that is, has prepared herself. And to her it was granted to be arrayed in fine linen, clean and bright, or as Moffat says, dazzling white. For the fine linen is the righteous acts, or righteousness, King James has, of the saints. Then he said to me, Write, blessed are those who are called, or those who have been invited, the Complete Jewish Bible has, to the marriage supper of the Lamb. That blessing is the fulfillment of the promise that Jesus made when he gave the parable back in Luke chapter 14, where he said, when you make a feast, you make a supper, you invite the weak, you invite the base, you invite all of these who are less privileged. And you will be recompensed when? At the resurrection of the just. Because you have learned agape and outgoing concern. Your mind has been reformed and refashioned so it's not selfish. You'll be there. And this is what he's talking about. Now, unlike Moses, Aaron, his 2 sons, and the 70 elders of Israel, who only saw a manifestation of God when they dined with him atop Mount Sinai, the first fruits will literally, which will include Moses, the first fruits will literally see God when they dine with him, for they will be spirit. They will be spirit. They will see him as he is in the realm of spirit, just as John tells us in 1 John 3, verse 2. We have no idea what we're going to be like in the spirit. We just know that when he comes, we will see him because we're going to be like he is. We're going to be spirit. Also, unlike Israel, who, after being told by God that if they obeyed him, they would become a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, they disobeyed him. They never received that promise. Unlike them, the first fruits will receive it. As it says over here in chapter 20, verse 6, breaking into verse 6, they shall be priests of God and of Christ and shall reign with him 1,000 years. Brethren, after reviewing the first Pentecost and the later ceremony, which was required on Pentecost, and understanding what all of those things mean to the resurrected saints, let's take to heart the admonition we find back here in Hebrews chapter 12, which again comes as the Apostle Paul brings us to the conclusion of points about coming up to Mount Sinai. We don't approach Mount Sinai. We approach God in heaven. We are admonished, and let's take this to heart. Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom of priests we're going to be a part of, which cannot be shaken, can never be destroyed, as Daniel chapter 2 shows. Let us have grace, or better in the New American Standard, let us show gratitude. Show gratitude to God, by which we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear.